October 18th, 1944. 0710 hours. Railspur, Fenland Marshes, Cambridgeshire, England. Unteroffizier Lucas Brenner climbed down from the slatted cattle wagon, boots slipping on wet timber as a fine, needling drizzle stung his cheeks. His wrists were tied with cord that felt too clean to be cruel. 3 nights without real sleep had ground railway soot into his uniform seams. His throat tasted of coal and old fear. Around him, roughly 200 men shuffled into something like order, their breath misting in pale ribbons that blew sideways across the flat land. They had been told what would happen. For years, posters and radio voices had drawn the British as hypocrites in polished boots, empire clenched beneath a white glove. There would be reprisals for the cities bombed, for the ships sunk. There would be punishments to balance some ledger scratched in Anglo-moral ink. Better to die upright than to live as a British captive, the voice had said, the microphone hissing like a whispering snake. Lucas searched for the promised ugliness. He saw instead a low siding bordered by scrub and nettle, a wind that flattened the grass into dark brushstrokes, and British soldiers standing in a tidy line as if snowed upon by discipline. Their rifles were held with a craftsman's calm. Their faces were watchful, but not hungry. No jeering, no boots slamming into ribs, no theater. Only the rasp of rope, the clink of metal, the damp cough of a locomotive easing its weight. A sergeant stepped forward, the sort of man who looked as though he'd grown up on porridge in early mornings. His hair was iron gray at the temples. His greatcoat wore the rain like it had seen worse. He addressed them in a serviceable German that left no room for mishearing. You will form ranks of 4. You will be searched. Wounded will be taken first. You will be given water. Then we move. Not a bark, not honey. Instruction, measured out with the same care someone might use to level flour in a cup. The search felt like a checklist unfolding. Pockets turned, knives catalogued, watches noted on a slate. Letters were removed, read, and returned to the same hands that had trembled folded paper for weeks. When a corporal found a locket with a child's photograph, he did not pocket it. He held it up, read the name scratched inside, and passed it back without comment. The wound wardens, the ones with white armbands, came next, scanning faces for trouble. A boy with a stitched scalp was pulled gently aside. A man whose cough had sunk into his chest like a stone was directed toward a waiting truck with a canvas roof and a lantern glow. Lucas tasted the drizzle and the iron of his own breath. He kept expecting the crack to come, the pivot from ritual to revenge. Instead, a private moved down the line with a metal jerry can, tipping water into dented cups. The private's hands were red from cold. He apologized when he spilled a few drops on a prisoner's sleeve, as if wet wool were a sin against Sunday. Next camp's not far, he added in English, then realized it wouldn't be understood, and only nodded like a man who had promised something small and intended to keep it. The rope around Lucas's wrists loosened as they loaded onto lorries. Not removed, just eased, enough to scratch an itch, enough to make the blood return. As the engines rumbled awake, he stared at the flat horizon and the dark threads of drainage ditches stitched through the fields. A gull hung in the wind, motionless, a white fleck pinned to the sky by invisible force. The lorry jolted forward. Somewhere in the cab, a kettle lid rattled. He had prepared himself to be broken. What he met, unsettling and precise, was order without heat, an enemy whose victory did not require a performance. And in that space, under a low English sky the color of pewter, the first hairline fracture appeared in the glass dome of everything he'd been told. The convoy rolled through an English countryside that looked half-painted, hedgerows trimmed into military geometry, barns leaning like old men, smoke lifting from distant chimneys that meant warmth and someone's supper. Lucas sat between 2 prisoners, each staring at their boots as if language had retreated there. The truck smelled of wet wool and exhaustion. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were rain on canvas and the rhythm of gears changing, slow and steady, as though the driver had all the time in the world.
By mid-morning, they reached a compound encircled by double barbed wire. Wooden watchtowers, their roofs slanted like church steeples, stood at the corners. A painted sign read, Camp 142, Ministry of War, Prisoner Section. Lucas expected dogs, shouting, maybe a slap to remind them who owned the daylight now. But the gates opened without spectacle. A corporal checked names from a manifest, one line at a time, and motioned them through with a pencil stub. The first thing Lucas noticed was how clean everything was. Not polished, functional. Gravel paths swept, barracks aligned like train cars, laundry flapping on ropes. It smelled of soap, smoke, and something faintly sweet. Oats, maybe. Inside the administration hut, a young British clerk with hair slicked down by rain pronounced each German name carefully, handwriting neat enough to belong in a schoolbook. Age, regiment, wounds, he asked through a translator. The tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Merely procedure. When his turn came, Lucas stammered his answers. The clerk nodded, writing faster than Lucas could speak, then gestured toward a doctor wearing an armband with a red cross. The medical check was brisk. Temperature, lungs, blood pressure. The doctor's stethoscope was cold, but his hands were steady. "You'll live," he said simply, then scribbled on a form and passed Lucas to the next table. They were issued blankets, tin bowls, and identification cards stamped POW 142. The cards were laminated with wax, edges curling from humidity. One guard, a Scotsman, judging by his accent, handed Lucas his spoon and said, "Mind you don't lose it. Hard to get another." There was a ghost of humor in the words, a kind of tired civility that felt stranger than any cruelty could have. That evening, when the dinner bell rang, Lucas lined up outside a low hall that smelled of stew. He braced for watery broth or the bitter porridge that he'd heard whispered about from Italian captives. Instead, the metal ladle dropped generous helpings of vegetables, chunks of beef, and even a slice of bread soft enough to press between his fingers. He sat on a bench with other men, each silent in disbelief. The steam rose in gentle ghosts. Somewhere behind them, a gramophone played a faint, scratchy tune, something British and mournful. He chewed slowly, afraid to finish too fast, as though the meal might evaporate if he didn't pace himself. Later, lying on a bunk that didn't collapse, Lucas watched condensation bead along the roof beams. The barracks were heated by a small stove. Its blow turned the room amber and unreal. He could hear the faint creak of boots outside, the sound of guards walking their route. Steady, predictable, almost comforting. He had expected chains, cruelty, punishment. Instead, he found rules, order, and tea so hot it burned his tongue. That night, as rain whispered against the windows, Lucas thought of Berlin's radio announcer, the one who had promised the British would grind German bones into fertilizer. He wondered what that man was doing now, and whether he'd ever tasted tea brewed by the enemy.
By December 1944, the frost had turned the camp fields white and brittle. Breath hung like fog, and boots cracked through morning ice. The men had settled into a rhythm that no one spoke about openly, a machinery of survival built from routine. Wake, roll call, tea, work, tea again, lights out. It was the kind of structure soldiers recognized instinctively, and because it was predictable, it was bearable. Lucas was among the first transferred to an agricultural detachment 20 miles east, near the village of Ely. The English countryside there looked almost unreal, flat as an unfinished painting, its horizons wrapped in mist and silence. The group of prisoners was driven out in a covered lorry, escorted by two guards who mostly talked to each other about football and petrol rations. When the truck stopped, a farmer waited at the gate, his hands deep in the pockets of an old waxed coat. "Name's Howard," he said, his accent thick with the vowels of the fens. "You work, you eat, you don't cause trouble, we'll get along." He had lost his brother in North Africa. Lucas learned that detail later, from a passing comment over a fence post. There was no bitterness in the farmer's tone, only a weary acceptance, like someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to be fair. The first day's work was hard,
Frozen earth resisted every shovel, and the wind seemed to come from all directions at once. But the routine built its own quiet dignity. Howard gave orders in short, practical sentences, half demonstrated with his hands. Lucas followed, learning quickly how to hitch a plow horse, mend a fence, clean a stable. At mid-morning, Howard called out, "Right then, tea." The prisoners looked at one another, unsure if they'd heard it correctly. The guard shrugged. They'd heard it 100 times. Howard opened a dented kettle, poured steaming liquid into mugs, and handed them out one by one. "Careful, hot." Lucas held the mug like an artifact. The tea was strong, bitter, slightly smoky. He took a sip, and warmth bloomed down his throat. Around him, the others stood silently, steam curling from the cups in their hands. Howard drank his own, leaning on a spade, eyes on the pale horizon. Nothing ceremonial, no speech, just a pause shared between men working the same ground. That small act, the farmer and his former enemies drinking together under the same gray sky, dissolved something unseen. Not friendship, but recognition. Humanity without the need for apology. In the weeks that followed, Lucas noticed other small kindnesses that seemed to happen as naturally as breathing. A guard lent him a pencil so he could write home. The camp cook slipped an extra slice of bread to a man with frostbite. When a prisoner's mother died back in Germany, the chaplain arranged a small service in a storage hut. British guards stood at the doorway, hats removed. Lucas began to write letters he never thought would pass the censor's eyes. "We are treated properly," he wrote to his wife. "They give us food, warm clothes, even tea. It feels strange to be shown decency by those we were told had none." Howard sometimes spoke to him in broken German learned from an old school book. He called Lucas Luke because it was easier to pronounce. When spring came, they sowed potatoes together, the soil soft again. The air smelled of rain and diesel, and Howard brought out a tin of biscuits one afternoon. Rationed, but I reckon you've earned it. Lucas didn't know what to say. He'd fought for a Reich that promised glory through obedience, and yet here, among enemies, he learned the quiet glory of fairness, of a man who brought tea instead of a whip. That night, as he watched the sunset pour red light through the barracks window, Lucas realized that war hadn't taught him what strength was. Captivity had. Spring arrived early in 1945. The frost gave way to thin sunlight and the soft hum of insects in the hedgerows. The fields near Ely turned green again, dotted with workers, British civilians and German prisoners alike, moving through rows of young crops. The war still raged across Europe, but here, in the quiet heart of England, time seemed to move at its own pace. Every day at precisely 10 in the morning, a whistle blew. That meant one thing: tea. Howard, the farmer, would haul out a battered kettle blackened from years of use, set it over a small fire, and pour steaming liquid into chipped enamel mugs. The guards would sit on crates, the prisoners on the ground or against the fence posts. The smell of strong black tea mingled with wet earth and hay dust. No one talked much, yet the silence itself was peaceful. Lucas remembered his first real conversation with Howard during one of these breaks. "You ever drink tea before the war?" Howard asked. "Coffee," Lucas answered. "Tea was for the English." Howard smirked. "Well, welcome to England then." The joke wasn't much, but it was a bridge, the smallest kind, built plank by plank between enemies. For Lucas, every cup of tea blurred the sharp edges of what he'd been taught. The broadcasts had said the British were decadent, arrogant, cruel, a people built on conquest. But he had never been offered tea by a man who'd lost his brother to the very army Lucas had served in. One morning, rain forced them to shelter inside the barn. Howard lit a small oil lamp, poured tea, and passed around biscuits. The guards drank beside the prisoners without ceremony. In that dim light, Lucas realized something profound. The British weren't performing goodness for propaganda or victory. They were simply being themselves, decent out of habit, not strategy. That realization disturbed him more than any beating could have. If everything he'd believed about the enemy was a lie, what did that make the rest of the war? What did that make him? Later that month, a new group of prisoners arrived at Camp 142. Men who had been captured in Holland, still loud with Nazi slogans and bitterness. They mocked the others for bowing to the English. Lucas said nothing, but he watched them slowly change. Within weeks, their pride began to soften, not because of British lectures, but because of tea, food, and the strange dignity of fair treatment. When even hatred met kindness every single day, hatred began to rot. One of those men, Otto Klein, had been a propaganda officer. He refused to drink tea at first, called it liquid surrender. But by summer, Lucas saw him sitting beside Howard, drinking quietly, eyes unfocused, as though trying to remember who had first told him that the British were monsters. When word came that Germany had surrendered in May, the camp fell silent. No celebration, just the muffled sound of rain against rooftops. The guards didn't gloat. They simply announced that the war was over and that everyone would soon be going home. That evening, Howard came by with one last pot of tea. He poured for Lucas and said, "War's done, you'll see your family soon." Lucas nodded. "You could have hated us," he said. "I did, but hate's heavy work, easier to make tea." That night, Lucas lay awake listening to the soft wind through the barracks and thought about how something as ordinary as tea had undone a lifetime of propaganda. He finally understood what real power looked like. It wasn't in rifles or flags, but in restraint.
Summer 1945 arrived with the smell of wet hay and diesel engines. Germany had surrendered. The war that had swallowed the world was ending. But for the men inside Camp 142, peace came like a rumor they didn't quite trust. No one cheered. There were no flags, no anthems, just quiet disbelief. The British Guards' routines never changed. Roll call, breakfast, work details, tea. It was as if victory hadn't altered their discipline. If anything, they seemed more careful now, perhaps because they could finally see their captives not as enemies, but as men who had survived the same storm. That month, the War Office announced that prisoners could begin sending longer letters home. The Red Cross delivered paper and dull pencils. Guards distributed them with a calm efficiency that bordered on kindness. Lucas sat on his bunk that night, staring at the blank page for a long time. He hadn't written to his wife in nearly 2 years. When he finally began, the words felt hesitant, like learning to walk again. "My dearest Anna, I am alive. The British treat us correctly, better than we deserve, perhaps. There is food, warmth, and work. I cannot explain the strangeness of being cared for by those we were told were savages. Do not believe what Berlin says. We were lied to." He sealed the letter, uncertain if it would pass the censors. 2 weeks later, the camp clerk handed it back with a stamp that read, "Approved for delivery." From that moment, letters began flowing both ways. Wives and mothers in Germany wrote of cities turned to rubble, of hunger and fear, but also of relief. Their sons were alive and safe in British hands. Each letter became a quiet weapon against propaganda. Every truthful line chipped away at the old lies. The British knew this, of course. Intelligence officers collected copies of outgoing mail.
studying tone and detail. They understood that the best way to win the peace was to let decency speak for itself. Life in the camp grew almost normal. The prisoners built furniture for local schools, repaired fences, and even played football matches against British units on Sundays. The guards kept score and occasionally clapped when the Germans scored a goal. A photographer from a London paper visited once, snapping a picture of smiling men in mismatched uniforms sharing tea on the sidelines. The caption would later read, "Enemies no longer, football in the fens." The photograph circulated quietly among families in Germany. For many, it was the first time they saw their sons not as defeated soldiers, but as human beings again. In late summer, a prisoner named Otto, the same man who had once sneered at liquid surrender, fell ill with pneumonia. The camp's medical officer, Captain Wilkes, treated him personally. When the fever broke, Otto told Lucas, half delirious, "I think the British are trying to save my soul with tea and blankets." They both laughed, but there was truth in it. No speech could have converted them, no film or pamphlet, only the quiet insistence of ordinary kindness, a system so steady that even cynicism wore down under its weight. By autumn, some prisoners began attending evening discussions run by British chaplains. Not sermons, just conversations about democracy, rebuilding, the cost of obedience. Lucas went once. The chaplain spoke slowly, saying, "Mercy isn't weakness. It's what keeps civilization alive when everything else collapses." Lucas didn't reply, but the words stayed with him. He thought of Howard, of the guards, of the nurse who once checked his fever with a steady hand. All of them living proof that mercy had survived the war, even when logic said it shouldn't have. He realized that when he returned home, he wouldn't bring back bitterness. He would bring back tea, the symbol of everything that had saved him from becoming the man the war wanted him to be. March 1948. The morning mist rolled low over the Cambridgeshire fields, turning every fence post into a silhouette. The war had been over for nearly 3 years, and yet its echoes still hummed in the soil, in the quiet cough of engines, in the distant toll of church bells rebuilt from melted wreckage. Camp 142 was closing. The last of the German prisoners, now technically workers, were to be repatriated. Lucas stood in the yard with his small duffel bag. Inside, a pair of work boots, a few letters from his wife, and a folded slip of paper, a reference written in the careful hand of Howard the farmer. This man worked honestly and well. He earned his pay and my respect. Robert Howard, Fendland Farm, Ely. Howard himself had come to see them off. His hair was thinner now, his shoulders more stooped, but the same warmth lingered behind his eyes. "You'll do fine back home," he said, shaking Lucas's hand. "World's got enough hate to last another century. Don't carry more of it." Lucas wanted to say something equal to the weight of what the man had given him, but all that came out was, "Thank you. For the work. For the tea." Howard smiled. "That's England for you. We solve everything with tea." The train that would take them to the port waited on the same siding where Lucas had first arrived 3.5 years earlier, cold, bound, expecting punishment. He remembered stepping off that train believing he'd walked into hell. Now, standing beside it again, he realized he had stumbled into something much stranger. Forgiveness, disguised as routine. As the train began to move, guards and farmers waved from the platform. There were no cheers, no music, just simple farewells shouted across the steam. Lucas leaned out the window until the camp disappeared behind the morning haze. The scent of coal smoke mixed with damp earth, and for a fleeting second, He thought it smelled like the tea kettle that had boiled every morning in Howard's barn. When the ship finally docked in Hamburg, the city was unrecognizable. Rubble, hollow buildings like broken teeth. But among the ruins, people were rebuilding, brick by brick, hand by hand. Lucas walked through his old neighborhood and felt no triumph, no shame, only clarity. The war had taken everything that shouted, flags, anthems, uniforms, and left only the quiet things that endured. Decency, patience, the stubborn refusal to become like what you fought. He returned to work as a bank clerk. He married again, had children who would grow up in a different Germany, a quieter one. And sometimes, on long winter evenings, he would brew tea for his family. His son once asked why he didn't drink coffee like most Germans. Lucas smiled faintly. "Because tea," he said, "reminds me that the enemy can be better than your teacher." Years later, when his grandchildren asked about the war, he didn't speak of battles or medals. He told them about the field in Ely, about a man named Howard, about how the British guards always made sure the tea was hot, even for those who had tried to kill them. They could have been cruel. We expected cruelty. Instead, they were civilized, and that was what broke us. Not their weapons, but their restraint. He would pause, sip his tea, and add softly, "Remember that strength isn't shouting the loudest. It's being decent when you have every reason not to be." The story of those quiet camps, of men who expected punishment but received tea instead, faded from history's headlines. Yet for thousands who lived it, the lesson remained carved deeper than any victory medal. That civilization survives not by crushing enemies, but by proving they were wrong about what civilization means. And somewhere in an English farmhouse, now silent with the ghosts of that era, an old kettle still hangs above the hearth, blackened, dented, and eternal. Proof that even in war's aftermath, kindness boiled on quietly. Decades later, long after the barbed wire had rusted into the English soil, the story of those quiet camps became a footnote in archives, a small, almost unbelievable chapter of humanity inside a world at war. In 1983, a BBC historian interviewed former guards and prisoners for a radio program called Enemies in the Garden. The tapes captured soft voices, British, German, sometimes trembling with age, remembering the same simple ritual, tea at 10 o'clock. The historian asked one of the former guards, Sergeant Alan Porter, what he remembered most about guarding the Germans. "Not much guarding, to be honest," Porter said with a faint laugh. "Mostly weather, rain, and blokes asking for seconds." When pressed about the treatment policy, his tone changed. "We'd seen what the Nazis did to their captives. We weren't going to become that. If you start treating men like animals, you end up one yourself. So we gave them tea. It wasn't kindness, it was discipline of the better kind." Those words became the heart of the broadcast and unexpectedly sparked letters from both sides of the channel. Listeners in Germany wrote in saying their fathers had spoken the same way, that captivity in Britain had been the first time they'd seen fairness without fear attached to it. One letter, read on air, came from Hamburg. It was signed by Lucas Brenner. "I was 19 when I expected death and received tea instead. The taste has never left me. I built my life on that moment. The proof that civilization is not a boast, but a choice made daily, even toward one's enemies." The letter ended with a line the producer later said silenced the studio for nearly a full minute. "I did not become British, but I became a better German because of them." In the years that followed, small memorials appeared near the sites of former POW camps. One stood outside Ely, beside a hedgerow where fields still turned golden every August. A small plaque read, "Here stood Camp 142, where enemies learned respect." Visitors left flowers and, occasionally, a mug of tea, always with steam still rising, as if waiting for someone to return. When Howard's grandchildren visited the site, they found a framed photo placed beneath the plaque, a black and white snapshot of two men in work clothes, one British, one German, standing side by side, mugs in hand, smiling awkwardly at the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, "Ely, 1945, we planted potatoes and something else, understanding." Time would move on, nations would change, but somewhere in that damp English earth, under the roots of hedges and crops and quiet memory, the lesson endured. That decency is not weakness, that restraint is not surrender, and that the smallest gesture, a cup of tea offered without hate, can outlast the noise of war by generations.